Good morning, and welcome. And it's a beautiful morning therefore outside, because if we're going to be inside, it's always an outside beautiful day. I'm Ann Hargraves. Roland Kuchel and I are co-chairs of the summer lecture series. Some of us, as I said last week, are here in Spalding Auditorium, and some are remote using Vimeo. We have members from 3 different OSHR programs joining us remotely. We welcome our sister programs, Granite State Ollie in Concord, New Hampshire, UMass in Boston, University of Georgia in Athens. Those in Spalding were given an index card on entering the auditorium. Please write your questions on this card and submit them to me at the break. There is also a wooden box on stage, right there, for you to drop your question cards into. For those of you joining us remotely, there is a chat window. If you would like to give your name and location, submit your questions there. Will, our student intern, will be writing these questions on index cards and giving them to the moderator at the break. We give our thanks to the underwriters who underwrite the whole series: the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Kendall at Hanover, The Village at White River Junction, Wells Fargo Advisors, and our sponsor for this week, Anonymous. This sponsorship is on behalf of all the small businesses in the Upper Valley. Last year, several of our speakers deplored the lack of civics education in our schools. Last week's speaker echoed it. A local organization, the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, has created a comic book which has sold nearly 10,000 copies in educator bundles to schools across the country. Copies of it are available at our registration desk for $5. I recommend it to you. And then she says, I have to find another piece of paper. Our speaker, Grant Tudor, is currently a policy advocate for Protect Democracy, where he develops and advocates for a range of policies to shore up our democratic institutions. He works often with large coalitions to influence federal policymaking with an emphasis on advancing accountability for abuses of power, strengthening Congress, and promoting electoral system reforms. He was prior a senior manager of political reform at Harvard's Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. Grant developed a commitment to fortifying democracy at home after working on various issues abroad, including as a visiting fellow with UNRWA, a UN refugee agency, and with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, a group that mediates armed conflict. He is also chairman of the board and a former founding partner of Nucleus Impact, a global research and design group that advises public, private, and multilateral organizations. Grant has written on issues of conflict and political reform in various academic and popular outlets, including The Atlantic, the Taiwan Journal of Democracy, Lawfare, Just Security, the Bangkok Post, and Brookings. He is most recently the author of Advantaging Authoritarianism, the U.S. Electoral System, and Antidemocratic Extremism. He received his MBA from Harvard Business School and MPP from Harvard Kennedy School, where he was a fellow at the Center for Public Leadership. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude from George Washington University. Please welcome Grant.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today, and of course, thank you to OSHR for inviting me to be here. I've long heard wonderful things about Dartmouth in the summertime. The rivers, the mountains, the weather. So in that spirit, I'm going to do my best today to remain sunny and optimistic. Despite the state of our democracy, my goal here, if I do my job correctly, is to communicate that something better isn't just possible, but achievable. That despite all of our democratic woes that seem quite intractable, there are levers, powerful levers, that we can contemplate pulling to safeguard and strengthen American democracy. Okay, so before we get into the meat of today's topic, our electoral system, I want to start with kind of a very quick but broader look at what's happening with US politics today, specifically as it relates to the authoritarian threat. With the January 6th Select Committee hearings going on, discussions about criminal liabilities for the former president and his associates, the hundreds of candidates across the country running on stolen election platforms, it seems unavoidable anywhere we look but to conclude that the authoritarian threat facing the US is not just a passing fad. Now, I'm sure that some folks in the room have seen maybe some version of a chart like this at kind of some point in time. What it shows is that the share of the vote for populist authoritarian parties has been steadily increasing among advanced democracies for a very long time. Now, authoritarian populists here are defined as parties and leaders who may ascend to power through democratic means, kind of get elected, but are anti-democratic once in power. So they attack civil liberties and rights, the rule of law, a free press, kind of generally claiming to do so on behalf of the people, usually in contrast to some outgroup, immigrants, minorities, etc. So one fair interpretation of this chart is that the authoritarian politics that have now kind of taken center stage in the US are not unique to us at this moment in time, right? To the contrary, what's happening here in the US is kind of part of a much larger global trend. I think most of us would agree that that's kind of a pretty uncontroversial point. And I think from a 10,000-foot view, that's right. But I don't think it's the whole story. Because while lots of advanced democracies today are confronting a rise in authoritarian politics, the US is really unique in at least two key ways. First, our nation's major conservative party is now ranked as more illiberal, anti-democratic, than almost every other major party among the world's advanced democracies. So for example, when assessing parties on two key dimensions, their support for racial and ethnic minority rights on one axis and their respect for liberal democratic norms, principles, practices on the other, political scientists rank the GOP all the way up in the upper right-hand corner. That means the GOP is now assessed as more extreme than the National Rally, Marine Le Pen's far-right party in France, and more closely in the company of parties like Poland's Law and Justice Party, which is actively dismantling democracy in Poland, as well as Germany's far-right party, the Alternative for Germany. In fact, there are only a few parties left among advanced democracies that are assessed as more liberal than the GOP. This wasn't always the case, obviously, right? There was a point not long ago when the Republican and Democratic parties, even if they had very different policy positions, were quite commonly committed to democracy. But largely starting around the Tea Party movement, the GOP began kind of a very different trajectory. Second, it's not just that the GOP is more extreme, it's that as a now center-right party, one that's been largely captured by a far-right party that's been captured by a far-right faction, it's also wildly more successful. Kind of other far-right parties across advanced democracies, despite increased support spanning decades, have nonetheless remained pretty marginal. There are actually very few examples of far-right parties experiencing much electoral successes, and when they do, their tenures have tended to be pretty short-lived. In fact, as the scholar Yasha Monk observed somewhat recently, across a lot of more advanced democracies today, these parties are actually suffering notable setbacks. So let's take the example of the Finns party, formerly the True Finns, a far-right party a nativist party that until recently was led by a very Trump-like figure, and that has had a meteoric rise in Finnish politics. In 2015, the Finns party boasted the largest gains made by any political party in post-war Finnish history, and then subsequently joined a coalition government with the center-right. It took less than 2 years for the Finns party to break apart after making a series of kind of messy coalitional compromises while in power. Long story short, the center-right party was largely responsible for having moderated their behavior while in office, and it's kind of so far kept them on the sidelines. So that story, or variations of it, is pretty common. Kind of despite what the headlines tend to say, authoritarian populist parties remain deeply unpopular among most publics. So for example, the Finns party has never quite breached a threshold of support of about more than a fifth of the electorate. So across advanced democracies, gains at the ballot box in recent years have either flatlined or abated, and then often it's the center-right party that's been responsible for marginalizing the far right. So in the Czech Republic last fall, for example, a broad coalition of center-right parties, together with the left, unseated the ruling populist party. And then shortly before that, in Israel, a right-leaning coalition brokered alliances with parties across the ideological spectrum to oust Netanyahu from power. The examples go on. And yet, meanwhile, here, the story is a bit different, right? Where the American far right is doing quite well. But that's not because they're more popular. As with most authoritarian populists, the Trump faction, which now dominates the GOP, is actually pretty unpopular. The political scientist Lee Drutman estimates that if Trump supporters were their own party, they'd be about as popular as Germany's Alternative for Germany, which is Germany's fifth most popular party. So these two things together suggest that something fishy is going on in the US. The GOP is markedly more extreme, with anti-democratic extremism rapidly escalating and frankly with no off-ramp in sight. And even though it's not much more popular than other far-right parties elsewhere, it is vastly more successful. Okay, so I posit to you all today that this is a really big problem. While limited support for the far right has translated into limited political power elsewhere, limited support for the far right in the US has translated into electoral victories and escalating extremism. So what gives? Research and analysis conducted at my organization, Protect Democracy, a little plug for a report we released earlier this year, informed by the research and work of many others, concludes that at least part of the problem probably lies in the very unusual US electoral system, the thing that actually translates support into power. So some of you may be very familiar with this term or this kind of branch of political science, some of you may not. So I'm going to strive to be as kind of clear as possible about what I mean here. In the simplest of terms, electoral systems are the sets of rules that govern how the preferences of voters are translated into electoral outcomes. In other words, how votes get translated into seats. Now, very rarely, if ever, is this a perfect translation process. So to illustrate, in both 78 and 81, New Zealand had elections in which the Labour Party won the most votes total, and yet another party, the National Party, won more seats and formed the government. In Canada, in 2008, the Green Party won just under 7% of the vote, but received 0 seats in the lower chamber. So those votes translated into nothing. And then here, in 2012, the Democratic Party won the most votes nationwide for the House, but the Republican Party took control with more seats. So something happens in between people voting and people assuming power, and it's not always clear-cut. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of breaking down the core components of an electoral system to better understand this translation process before we look at why our particular system may be contributing to a rise in authoritarian politics. Fair warning, though, as the political scientist Robert Dahl once said, the subject of electoral systems is fearfully complex and for many people, fearfully dull as well. Although I have to disagree, I think this stuff is very exciting. So I'm hoping that by the end of this, you will be in my camp. So let's spend a few minutes going through kind of a relatively oversimplified review, but one that should provide some tools to better examine the system that we have and why it's perhaps not working particularly well for democracy. At its most basic, every electoral system can be deconstructed into 3 interacting rules. Taken together, they constitute the kind of basic machinery of the translation process. The first rule is district magnitude, or the number of seats per district. So for example, voters in Washington state elect 2 officials to represent their state in the lower chamber, so district magnitude of 2, whereas voters in, say, Arkansas select 1. The second is ballot structure, or how voters are allowed to express their preferences when casting their votes. So for example, in Salt Lake City, voters rank their candidates by preference, first, second, third, when filling out a ballot for the city council election, whereas voters in Philadelphia select 5 candidates out of 7. And third, electoral formula is how votes are counted to determine winners and allocate seats. So for example, if no candidate for a Georgia Senate seat obtains an outright majority, which is what we observed, right, during the last election, the top 2 voters advance to a runoff in order to secure one. Everywhere else, I think except Louisiana, the candidate with the most votes simply wins, kind of regardless of any majority threshold. So every electoral system has to unavoidably select a district magnitude, a type of ballot structure, and an electoral formula. Within each of these rule categories, there's a nearly limitless set of choices to pull from. So this table kind of vastly oversimplifies the range of options, but it should give kind of a basic flavor of some of the sample choices. So for example, district magnitude, one can have a single member district where each district is represented by just a single elected official, or a multi-member district where each district is represented by 2 or more elected officials. With ballot structure, voters can select 1 candidate with categorical ballots, or sometimes 1 party, or with what's called an ordinal ballot, voters can rank their choices in order of preference. And then electoral formula, do you need a plurality to win? Do you need a majority to win? Or are you simply elected in proportion to the votes that you receive? Okay, if you forget all of that, here's the important thing to remember. The decisions using those few rules, just those 3, generally give rise to systems that fall into 2 very broad categories. On the one hand, winner take all, and on the other, some form of proportional representation. Both have lots of variance, but for today's purposes, let's not worry about them. In winner-take-all systems, you have a single-member district, so a district magnitude of 1, and if someone wins 51%, they get to represent the whole district, 100%, by themselves. The other 49% get nothing, no representation. Why it's called winner-take-all. So it tends to produce non-proportional outcomes. So if you think about it in the extreme, imagine every district in a country is won by the same party with that 51%. So that party would have 100% representation in the legislature, even though they enjoy just barely over half of the country's support. By contrast, proportional systems try to ensure that parties are represented kind of more or less in proportion to the votes that they receive. And they accomplish this in part through having multi-member districts. So if you have, say, 5 members per district and a voter base of 20%, say a progressive party or a libertarian party, that 20% would secure one of the 5 seats. What this also means is that proportional systems are also typically multi-party systems, whereas winner-take-all systems typically only have room for 2 parties. So why do these things matter? 2 major reasons. Returning to our various design choices, first, these choices ultimately limit or create the possibility of certain electoral outcomes. So for instance, under a plurality rule, a type of electoral formula, certain outcomes are possible that are just simply not permitted under alternative formulas, such as a candidate winning an election with less than a majority of the vote. So in 2010, Paul LePage won the gubernatorial Republican nomination next door in Maine with 37% of the primary vote, and then won the general election again with 37% of the vote. Despite regularly ranking as among the most unpopular governors in the US during his first term, LePage secured a second term, again with a minority of the vote. As another example from the Northeast, the 3rd Congressional District in Massachusetts has been represented by a Democrat for more than 2 decades. So let's say that we change the district magnitude of that district from 1 to 3. So it sends 3 representatives to the House instead of just 1. Now that district, if I remember correctly, is about 1/3 Republican. That district would now then probably send 2 Democrats and 1 Republican to Congress. That district is currently considered safe, but with a district magnitude of probably at least 3, the concept of safe and swing districts that we're familiar with begins to disappear. And that's because with higher district magnitudes, more people's votes start to matter. So these rules kind of fundamentally structure outcome possibilities. They also shape the behaviors of political actors and voters. So for example, how does having multiple officials representing the same district affect their legislative behavior, like here in New Hampshire? Research from New Hampshire, as well as Maryland, North Carolina, Vermont, and West Virginia, all of which have used multi-member districts to elect state legislators, found that collaboration on legislation between representatives of the same district, both within and across parties, increased with higher district magnitudes and decreased with lower ones. Voters also change their behavior in response to different rules. So for example, as we all know, voters, including perhaps some of the folks in this room, don't always select their preferred candidate, their sincere choice at the ballot box, but sometimes just back the candidate who seems more likely to win, something called strategic voting. But that behavior is not, in fact, universal. It is in direct response to certain rules, for example, providing voters with a categorical ballot in a plurality election. Here's a real example. In 2016, as Trump collected more primary contest wins, voters in later primaries became more likely to select Trump rather than waste their vote. Even though research found that many didn't necessarily support him, they just thought he was most likely to win. So scholars debate and disagree about the specific effects of different rule choices and combinations of rules. But one thing they tend to agree upon is that the electoral system choices we make have profound implications for who gets sent to office and how they behave. So while there is absolutely no such thing as a best electoral system, there's also no such thing as a neutral one. Whether by conscious design or historical happenstance, the basic features of electoral systems structure outcomes and shape political behavior. Although there is some consensus on what constitutes a better or a worse system. So certain systems tend to be ranked among the least desirable in surveys of political scientists on a variety of dimensions: accountability, government performance, descriptive representation, etc. This is especially true with respect to divided societies, given that certain systems tend to perform better at facilitating cooperation and accommodation among rival groups, while others tend to exacerbate social cleavages. So for example, a winner-take-all system known as single-member plurality is regularly ranked among the least desirable electoral systems in the world across any number of dimensions, but especially when it comes to its use in highly polarized societies. Speaking of single-member plurality, that's ours. It is a winner-take-all electoral system in which voters of a given district are represented by a single official and may express their preference at the ballot box for a single candidate who wins by securing more votes than the next closest rival. So you'll see each of the 3 rule choices reflected here. To be clear, we don't, in fact, have a single electoral system. We use different systems for different types of elections. But single-member plurality is the most common, and it's by and large, with a few exceptions, what we use for the US House and most state legislatures. I think it's important to note that this is a really uncommon system today. It's also used in the UK, Canada, and India, and a handful of former smaller British colonies. And also that it's not something the founders gave much thought to. It's what the British used, and we just inherited it. Today, the vast majority of democracies do not use winner-take-all systems like this. Instead, they use various kinds of proportional systems. So we are an outlier. The case I'd like to make here is that our electoral system is aggravating anti-democratic extremism, and in two ways. It's accelerating the threat, and it's making it harder to contain and combat. So I want to flag here before diving into the how that while the observation here is that our electoral system is compounding a problem, the authoritarian threat is absolutely multi-causal. Economic reasons, social reasons, cultural reasons, and also that reforms of any kind are not going to magically make it go away. Instead, the argument here is that our specific electoral system is playing a harmful rather than a helpful role. How so? So in the paper produced by my organization earlier this year that I referenced, we identified kind of various pathways by which the basic rules of our system are either accelerating extremism or blunting our ability to counteract it. So I'm going to do a brief run-through of 5 of those pathways here, though of course they're not exhaustive. Starting with number 1, biased outcomes. In post-war Britain, parliamentary governments received, on average, 45% of the vote, but 54% of the seats. Today in the US, House Republicans enjoy a pretty durable 5 to 6% seat bonus. So similarly, a prediction that they'll win more seats than we'd expect, kind of based on their share of the vote. And that's because a single-member plurality system, by design, generates these types of biases. So the system originally developed in the UK with the intention of creating a kind of strong party government, in part by exaggerating electoral wins. Here in the US, that bias used to favor Democrats for a very long time before party realignment, but either way, these biases are a kind of predictable feature of the system. And they are made possible by our district magnitude decision of using single-member districts, which allow for what's called an inefficient distribution of partisans. So for example, consider a state with 4 congressional districts where there are 60% Republican and one is 80% Democratic. This is obviously stylized, but it generally reflects like a pretty common trend in the US where Democrats are kind of packed into more urban areas, in this case, District 4, and Republicans are more spread out across less urban areas. So in each of the first 3 districts, 60% of the vote translates into a 100% win, right? If you get 60% of the vote, you take the entire district, winner take all. Now, had Democratic voters been spread out across more districts, they may have carried more seats. So seats aren't really just a function of votes, but of the spatial distribution of votes. So in this 4th district, Democrats didn't actually need that extra 30% of the vote share. It was wasted. The key part here is that the importance of a party's relative concentration of voters is unique to lower district magnitudes, especially the lowest, ours. So systems with single-member districts can kind of predictably generate these types of aggregate biases because you win seats out of proportion to your vote. So why does this matter? Well, ultimately, the structurally advantaged party needs fewer voters to win, and then probably behaves accordingly. So today, the bias favoring the GOP is pervasive at federal and state levels. So for example, after the blue wave election of 2018, Democrats failed to take control of several state legislatures and congressional delegations in spite of winning comfortable majorities of votes. And it stands to reason that this kind of bias decreases the advantaged party's need to appeal to broader-based majorities. As it happens, an important component of authoritarian consolidation in Hungary has involved changes to its electoral system such that it more closely mirrors winner-take-all elections here in the US. In 2011, new electoral rules helped Orbán's party, Fidesz, to win 67% of the seats with 45% of the vote. And this past April, just a few months ago, the party won 54% of the vote, which then translated into 83%. In a nutshell, Hungary's electoral system has simply been made less proportional. So it now elects more than half of its legislature from single-member districts, generating a very large seat bonus for Fidesz, the ruling party. Second, this issue of spatial distribution takes on a really pronounced racialized dimension in the US. In Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina, Black voters constitute roughly between kind of 25 to 30% of the vote, but they're only awarded 14 to 16% of the seats. Now, this isn't nefarious per se, but it is a predictable feature of low district magnitude given the spatial distribution of black voters. The solution to this has been to pack minorities into districts, or to what's called affirmatively gerrymander, to create majority-minority districts. So this ensures kind of some predictable representation, but it comes at a really steep cost. Packing minorities into districts often wastes substantial shares of their votes. So again, if you have a district where 80% is voting for the Democratic candidate, that means at least 30% of those votes are wasted. Research also suggests that packing minorities into districts, into a single-member district, advantages the opposing party in the surrounding districts because it makes them far less competitive. So this kind of dilution of minority votes, kind of making huge shares of the minority vote not matter, probably carries a lot of troubling ramifications in the context of rising extremism, especially given the white supremacy driving the current authoritarian movement. Third, single-member plurality tends to reward more coherent factions that vote together at the expense of kind of more distributed majorities that don't. So these figures are some of Trump's primary contest wins in 2016. It's not actually that impressive. In a majority of primaries, in fact, a majority of Republican voters did not prefer Donald Trump, and he won nonetheless. And that's because strong factional support for one candidate defeated broadly distributed support for others. So Trump voters were not the majority, they just did a better job of voting it together, while the non-Trump voters split their votes among lots of other candidates, right? Marco Rubio, John Kasich. In a single-member plurality system, strong factions tend to have a leg up. This dynamic is a function of the plurality rule, right? A type of electoral formula where you need more votes than your next closest rival, but you don't need a majority. So the prior two issues that we just discussed were a function of district magnitude. This is a function of the electoral formula, our use of plurality to decide winners. As it turns out, plurality wins made possible without a majority, are pretty common in the US. And the effect, probably, is that political actors are both responding to and mobilizing narrower factions rather than appealing to broader cross-sections of the electorate. Okay, so much of this so far has been about what's giving the far right a leg up, generating aggregate biases, diluting minority votes, privileging coherent factions. But it's also probably the case that our electoral system makes it a lot harder to in turn address the problem. Party competition is a very good example of that, which has been weakening in the US for a very long time, meaning that there are kind of very few competitive counterforces as the GOP spirals. Consider that in each of the 4 national elections between 1998 and 2004, more than 90% of all races were won by non-competitive margins of more than 10%, with an average margin of 40%. And it's estimated that 92% of House races this coming November in the midterms will be uncompetitive. So what's termed geographic sorting is typically the named culprit here. The more that red voters and blue voters cluster together, the less competitive a district becomes, right? But that spatial sorting, as we just discussed, only matters in systems with low district magnitude. So the real culprit here is a rule choice, not some natural phenomenon. As the sorting intensifies without changing the underlying rule, the inter-party competition is going to get worse. And then as the far right consolidates more power, it will face less and less competitive pushback. So what we see is a kind of feedback loop with single-member districts and party competition that has been getting a lot more troubling for some time in the US. As more partisans are geographically clustered, single-member districts become even more lopsided with kind of one dominant party. That obviously means less competition. But making matters worse, after one party crosses into the safe district threshold, the opposing party is incentivized to withdraw their party-building resources, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense to compete there anymore. And then competition worsens even more. A good example of this is Lauren Boebert from Colorado, the congresswoman. She won her election with a just over 6% margin, which seems pretty small, but that's enough to make the district safe. And so the Democratic Party, this coming November, has not put her district on the contest list. They're withdrawing. Although it's not just that there is increasingly little competition between the two parties, it's also that there's only two parties, right? So there's occasionally media coverage about folks, for example, folks in the Never Trump camp threatening to launch a third-party bid, a new center-right party to compete with the GOP nationally. The problem is that no matter how well-intentioned or how well-financed, efforts to launch competitive alternatives are mostly incompatible with single-member plurality. It's not a function of will or money, it's a function of the underlying rules. So two basic variables in the single-member plurality system tend to interact to produce a two-party equilibrium. Not always, but most of the time. Something known as Duverger's law. So first, in single-member districts, some parties, almost always the largest ones, will be overrepresented, right, receiving a greater proportion of votes than seats. And then voters rightly perceive that smaller parties will have a lower likelihood of winning the single seat available. And so in response, they avoid wasting their vote. So these two factors tend to interact to generate a two-party system. Even if a majority of voters, even if a majority of the folks in this room would prefer a third-party option, such as a new center-right party, and by the way, 60% of voters nationally do, it will almost certainly not prevail. In a famous study of a few dozen democracies in 2014, the US ranked #1 in terms of having the strictest two-party system. So I think it's important to emphasize here that like any duopolistic market, two-party systems tend to be very stable. I think the last time that a major party collapsed or was functionally replaced was over 160 years ago. And that was at a time when the US featured a much less rigid two-party system. So the takeaway here is that meaningful political competition, either from Democrats or from a new challenger party, is most likely not coming, and is not going to be a source of counteracting the GOP's radicalization. All right, last and fifth, how our electoral system structures political conflict as binary. So this graph from research published in 2020 looks at the relationship between affective polarization, so how much we dislike the other side, not just disagree with, but dislike, and how proportional the country's electoral system is. As a reminder, higher district magnitudes create more proportional systems with multiple parties. And what the research found was that animosity is intensified in systems like ours, the least proportional and with only two parties. I think this makes intuitive sense, right? When you split a country up into just two opposing factions, as opposed to having options for multiple and more fluid groups, folks are going to grow to dislike each other. Now, how does this relate to extremism? Well, in this context, among political leaders and voters, defeating the opposition takes clear priority over addressing extremism within one's own group. Right? You want to crush the opposition no matter the cost. So, for example, during the 2016 election, even self-identified moderates within the Republican Party coalesced around the extreme option of their party, right? The alternative was less acceptable, to join the opposing team. So consider that in March of 2015, 74% of Republican voters said that they could never imagine supporting Trump. A year later, only 38% agreed. So our binary structure, also importantly, escalates the purging of in-group moderates. And I use the term moderate here, not in an ideological sense, but in a moderating sense, right? Moderating extremism. The structure breeds kind of a psychology of, if you're not with us, then you're against us, right? You're with them, and you need to go. So the retaliation, even against very conservative political leaders like Liz Cheney for speaking out against her party's authoritarian turn, seems to be pretty good evidence of this. Generating electoral biases, rewarding coherent factions, weakening party competition, diluting minority voting power, entrenching binary conflict, these things are not a given. They are expressions of system design choices. Okay, so where do we go from here? I'm realizing, by the way, I made a promise at the beginning of this, which was that I would be sunny and optimistic. So here's the optimistic part. There's actually a lot of experimentation already happening across the country with electoral systems, especially at the subnational level, states, cities, et cetera. As Pew Research found last year, at least 261 jurisdictions in the US featured an alternative to single-member plurality, with a fifth of those having adopted an alternative within the past 4 years. And this isn't new. In fact, if we go all the way back to the American Revolution, multi-member districts were the norm, what was then called plural districts. Various states featured a majority requirement for congressional elections, not plurality. So there's always been a lot of change and experimentation. So I'm going to focus, with the remaining time that I have, on one major reform for congressional and state house elections. But I concede that this is only one reform among many that are out there. So going back to our kind of basic design decisions table, I'm going to argue that among the most powerful changes to our electoral system would be a switch from single-member districts to proportional multi-member districts, also sometimes just called proportional representation. I'm going to tick through next the reasons why exactly this would be especially powerful, particularly to combat escalating extremism. But I also just want to flag that while in many ways this would be novel for us, it's actually like a pretty non-unique proposal, which is to say we'd really just be joining most of the rest of our democracy friends around the world in switching to a more proportional system. So before getting into the merits, like what would this actually look like? A few years back, the New York Times editorial board published a piece that offered what I thought were some helpful visualizations. I especially liked this one from Texas. The idea is pretty straightforward. In this case, the state's current 36, maybe 38 now with redistricting, congressional districts would be combined into, say, 10 or 11, with 3 to 5 representatives each. And whereas there is currently projected to be one swing district this coming November remaining in all of Texas, under a multi-member system, there isn't a single district where one party dominates. Because as it turns out, there are, in fact, quite a significant number of Democrats throughout Texas. Same thing would be true in California, which, if I'm remembering correctly, has more Republican voters than any other state in the union. But with winner-take-all rules, these groups are dramatically underrepresented in their respective states. So this visualization doesn't actually contemplate parties beyond R2, right? But we know that from the political science literature, districts with 5 or so members would probably give rise over time to about 4 to 6 viable parties. Okay, so now what would proportional multi-member districts actually solve for? At least 4 big issues, each of which should now be familiar. First, a more proportional system would lessen the structural advantages favoring one party over the other, in any direction. And it would do this through 2 ways. First, multi-member districts aren't sensitive to spatial distribution of voters in the same way that single-member districts are. So where a voter lives doesn't really matter as much, right? It doesn't determine whether or not their vote gets to count. So if you're a Democrat in Oklahoma right now, your vote functionally does not matter, right? The entire delegation is red. But under proportional rules, between 1 and 2 of, say, its 5 seats would likely be held by Democrats. So being a Democrat in Oklahoma then actually matters. Seats better reflect votes. And then second, with multi-member districts of 5 or greater, gerrymandering becomes functionally impossible. Like one of the reasons why gerrymandering seems so pervasive in the US and not so elsewhere is because as district magnitude increases with more proportional systems, it becomes much more difficult to do. So a party can also further exacerbate a bias through creative line drawing. Second, the far right would also face increased competition, and again, through 2 ways. So first, as we saw, winner-take-all elections create safe districts, insulating extremists from inter-party competition. So in almost every single congressional district today, a more radicalized GOP faces 0 meaningful competition. Under more proportional rules, the idea of swing and safe districts weakens, kind of increasing inter-competition, at least at the district level. And that's because in most districts, more than one party now has a viable chance at securing at least 1 seat. So it makes sense for opposing parties, for alternatives to extremist candidates to start investing there. And then second, single-member districts also insulate extremists from new competition, given that they tend to structurally prohibit more than 2 effective parties. So whereas in multi-member districts, more winners per district also permit more electorally viable parties to emerge and successfully contest legislative seats. So for example, a new center-right party to compete against the GOP. Third, we would expect a significant increase in the representation of racial and ethnic minorities. If there's a group that's about, say, a third of the electorate, and that group more or less votes similarly, we would expect about a third of the seats to represent them. It would also, and I think this is especially important given current events, obviate the legal fights over racial gerrymandering, right? With enough representatives per district, it doesn't matter how you draw the lines. It becomes functionally impossible to gerrymander away racial and ethnic minority voting power. So the key point is that under winner-take-all rules, it's really difficult to ensure representation, fair representation, for groups that perpetually fall under the majority threshold. And the Band-Aid solutions that we've developed, like majority-minority districts, generate all kinds of problematic side effects. So fundamentally, winner-take-all systems and racialized voting, which is quite common in the US, are a toxic combination, whereas proportional systems give each group a better shot at securing meaningful and fair representation. Given that the undermining of minority rights is pretty central to the authoritarian project here and around the world, ensuring that these votes carry equal weight seems pretty important. And fourth, proportional representation breaks down the binary structure of political conflict. So right now, if you are a dissatisfied Republican that's decided you're not really on board with the trajectory of your party, or you're a Republican who has spoken out and in turn been ostracized by your party, where do you go? Your options are to join the opposing team or do nothing. Those are not great options. Under a proportional system, we would expect room for more than just two parties, and that includes the center-right party. And that's what we saw, right, just about 30 minutes ago in other democracies, the importance of having a center-right option when it calls for it. And so while we kind of have to rely on a lot of comparative research to kind of substantiate these arguments, the experience of other countries with various forms of proportional representation, right, kind of where we would draw from, some scholars are actually simulating what the effects might look like in the US context. So one notable simulation from a few years back found that the number of districts, and this is under a certain type of proportional system for the House, the number of districts with an unpredictable electoral outcome would increase from 15% to 43%, so a dramatic increase in political competition. The electoral bias favoring the GOP, which again, at some point in time could also favor the other party, would decrease from 5 percentage points to 1. And black voters who could elect at least one candidate of their choice would increase from 40% to 98%. So as I said, this is only one reform to one piece of a much larger electoral system puzzle in the US. We didn't talk about the Senate, we didn't talk about the presidency, we didn't talk about governorships, and as one particularly big elephant in the room, we didn't talk about primaries. So maybe we can get to some of that in the Q&A. But one of the reasons I focused on proportional representation for the legislature is because it's actually quite possible. Not all powerful change is a pipe dream. Consider the fact that proportional representation for the House, never mind state legislatures, does not require, say, passing a constitutional amendment. In fact, Congress, tomorrow, could pass a law that allows states to experiment with proportional elections for their congressional delegations. The national simulation that I just referenced a few moments ago, that's actually simulating the effects of a bill currently in Congress, something called the Fair Representation Act, that would do exactly that. I believe, and someone should fact check me, but I believe bills this year have also been introduced in the New Hampshire State House for proportional representation. And as more, of course, advocates and reformers engage, we can probably expect more legislative proposals at both the federal and state levels. What I want to emphasize, more than anything, is that these electoral design levers matter a lot. And part of our democratic revival will almost certainly involve thinking optimistically and creatively and bravely about how to use them differently. Thank you.
Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed your break. I'm auctioning off a pair of glasses. What am I bid? Shall I keep them here at the podium? Nobody wants to bid on these glasses. Okay, they're going to be here at the podium. And now, I want to welcome back Grant, and we'll get to your questions. The first question is a thank you. This was fascinating and inspiring. I took notes as much as I could. Will your slides be available after the lecture for attendees to review? And Grant has already said yes. So if you want to see the slides, check with the office. Second question, what is your organization doing to support the Fair Representation Act?
Good question. So I have to give credit to another organization called Fair Vote. For folks who are not familiar, look them up. They're a national organization, and they've actually been on the front lines of thinking through electoral system reform for quite a long time, putting these issues on the national agenda. And I think, among other advocacy groups and scholars, have partnered with Hill offices for a long time to develop legislation like the Fair Representation Act. Protect Democracy, we're a more recent organization. We started just after the 2016 election, and the vast majority of our work has been focused on kind of addressing some of the most acute threats facing our democracy. It's only been in the past year or so that we've kind of been contemplating kind of what a better democracy looks like for tomorrow that gets at some of like the structural reasons why we keep facing these crises on a near-term basis. Is that me, by the way? Am I holding it too? Okay. All of which is to say, we've begun starting with a report like this, a lot of work on the research and analysis front to build a case for why bills like the Fair Representation Act would go really far, not just to more fairly represent American voters, but also to address rising extremism.
This lecture series is sponsored by institutions managing wealth and health. No surprise given the gray-haired audience. What can you say to my grandchildren to spark them to accomplish the electoral reform you advocate?
Sure. This is on the back of some of the conversations that we were having outside just now. I think it is so easy to be pessimistic, and for very good reason, right? Especially if you're a younger person today, kind of looking at the landscape, the political landscape, the country that you are about to inherit. It's really easy to kind of tune out because it is so... Oh, yeah, of course. Thank you. It's easy to tune out because it's so kind of overwhelmingly, right? The headlines are really difficult. That said, we've been in really dark places as a country before, right? I mean, before any of us were alive. The Civil War and post-war period, Jim Crow. There's been a lot of waves in American history where things have been quite dark. And so I think it's important, and if I were saying this to a young person, I would say, it's really important to kind of step back from our immediate present, as terrible as it might seem on a lot of dimensions, and respect the fact that a lot of our forefathers have been here before, and through a lot of creativity and ingenuity and hard work and optimism, we've not just gotten through it, but we've made a much better country out of it.
What is the role of independence in the electoral count?
I think that's a topic for another entire lecture. So a couple quick things which I think are really important, because the way that kind of independents get covered in media, I think, is not always accurate. Often we think about independent voters, and I'm sure there's a number of them in this room, as nonpartisan, right? They don't hold strong partisan beliefs. They kind of, right, they don't associate with partisan affinities. And in some cases, especially with the latter, that's true, right? They're not putting on a partisan hat. But data consistently show that independents, by and large, people who are self-identified as independent, by and large, are not less partisan in their beliefs, in their policy positions, and most importantly, in the way that they vote. And so one way that this comes through quite clearly is in the context of party primaries. So where there are open primaries and independents can participate, the data tends to show that those independents are participating much the same way that another partisan who does identify with the political party participates. So I think kind of just one kind of myth to break is that by virtue of simply saying one is an independent doesn't necessarily mean that one is kind of less partisan than someone else. I think point two, though, in terms of kind of how this relates to the topic today, the fact that there are so many independents, it's the largest political group now in the country, right? Political independents make up a much larger section of the electorate than Republicans, than Democrats. And I think that should be kind of troubling, because what that says is independents don't see a home for themselves politically in the two-party structure that we have. My thesis today is if we had a multi-party system where there were options that were not just two, that for a lot of people are very unsatisfying and for very good reason, independents would probably more likely to not be independent. They'd find a home, right? They'd be in the, call it, business and government, small government party. They'd be in the progressive party. They'd be in the Green Party. There would be a home for them.
Slightly related question. Are third parties a good idea, or do they just take away votes from the major parties? Yeah,
it's such a good question. It's a complicated answer. So I think you have to ask the question in two different scenarios. Scenario one, are third parties helpful today in this current system, the one that we talked through, single member plurality? And are third parties helpful under alternative systems, right? More proportional systems? I think if I did my job correctly, I'm hoping I, begun to convince you that the latter is a yes. Having options for multiple parties in a multi-party context could tackle a lot of the problems that we face. In the current system, it still depends on the rules. So I think a group of us were talking about this at the break, that third-party challengers, where the rule is plurality, not a majority, allows third parties to split the vote. And so sometimes individuals, actually Paul LePage is a really good example of this, get elected to office that the majority did not want, which is kind of wild, right? And that happens because there's more than two challengers in the race, right? There's an either independent running, there's a third-party candidate running, and that person strips votes away from who would otherwise be the majority winner. So to some degree, third parties, right, by spoiling, can have negative effects. But there are solutions to this that actually are not part of the solution set that we talked about. So also using Maine as an example, as most folks I'm sure know, right, a number of years ago, Maine next door introduced ranked choice voting. And one of the reasons that it introduced ranked choice voting was because ranked choice voting establishes a majority rule, not just a plurality rule, for winning elections. So you have to win a majority, not a plurality. And in that context, with that different rule, the spoiler effect isn't possible, right? So, after the first round of voting, if the third-party candidate didn't, place last, which usually happens, those votes are then reallocated to someone's second choice, as opposed to letting those votes spoil the election. So I think the short answer is, under the current system, third parties often spoil elections. That's problematic. But there are tweaks to our rules. Ranked choice is one of them. Majority runoffs, like in Georgia, are another. That can solve for that spoiler effect.
Vermont has one congressional rep. How can we have proportional representation? And allied, in a small state such as Vermont, would it make more sense to have seats for the state legislature voted on by the whole state and not by district?
That's a great question. So I think it depends on the size of the state. Under the Fair Representation Act, and there's different models out there. The New York Times editorial board used a slightly different model. Some states, because of their small size, would just collapse into a single district, right? And then you'd have 3 or 4 or 5 representatives from that district. Rhode Island, right, would be like a very obvious example. Kind of carving up Rhode Island into multiple districts and placing 5 members in each of them would not be practical. So I think in part it's a question of the population. So I think to the latter part of that answer, the question is yes. But was there a former part that I didn't get to?
No, the first question was that Vermont, it was really a statement. We have 1 congressional rep. How can we? I'm sorry. The first part of the question was, how can a state with 1 congressional rep have proportional representation?
Right. Yeah, so the simple answer is yes, the entire state would be a single district and there would be multiple representatives from that state.
What do party leaders think about proportional representation, particularly if the seats are elected by a single transferable vote system? And before you start, could you please define transferable vote?
I'm getting quizzed, okay. So first, as far as what party leaders think of the system, you all should ask them, especially come election time. And then 2, I don't have the answer to that question. Which actually, maybe I'll do a quick aside here, which is to say, there are some pockets, universities are a good example of them, where conversations of this sort are quite common, right? We put some of these ideas on the table, they can be complex, they're interesting, right? We chew on them, we kind of make informed judgments about them. It's obviously not the case for the vast majority of the country, and I don't expect anytime soon that the vast majority of the US is going to be having a robust debate about proportional representation. I hope, but I don't think that's necessarily around the corner. But I think that means it is incumbent on us to start asking those questions publicly, including to our elected officials. So single transferable vote, what that refers to, it was actually up on the slide when I was comparing proportional systems to winner-take-all systems. It's just a very fancy, whatever, academic sounding word for a type of proportional system. It's used in Australia, Malta, Ireland, I might be missing one. And all it means is a country that uses multi-member districts combined with ranked choice voting. And that's the method by which winners are proportionally allocated to votes. So for example, if Maine, just to use that example as a thread, if tomorrow Maine were to adopt proportional representation, together with its existing use of ranked choice, it would have a single transferable vote system. Was it asking for something more than the definition, or was that? Okay, that's the definition.
A thought experiment. Suppose the U.S. were a single district with proportional representation. Would that result in more minority representatives, more political parties, more affected government, or less stability?
Less stability. So the district magnitude threshold matters a lot. I don't know if anyone here follows Israeli politics, but Israel is an example of a country that doesn't have districts. The entire country is the district. So they have, 120 members in the legislature, and they're elected at large, right, from the entire country. There's a direct relationship between increased district magnitude, which is to say the number of representatives, right, per district. In this case, for the US, it would be, 435, as opposed to 3, 4, or 5, so it's a massive increase. There's a direct relationship between the increase in district magnitude and then the number of viable parties. Now, having more parties, given the case that I was trying to make, I think is a good thing, but up into a point. So political scientists will refer to the term party fractionalization. And what that refers to is, I think that the questioner used the term chaos. After a certain threshold, it's actually probably not that helpful to have lots and lots and lots of parties. I mean, think about Congress, right? Introduced, and we already have factions in Congress, right, within the 2 major parties to some degree, but having, 12, 13, 14 parties would largely make the Congress ungovernable. And so, I think that there's a little question of balance here. 2, not so great. 20, probably also not so great.
Jim at Granite State Alley says, it appears that state legislators may have U.S. constitutional authority to ignore elections and directly select the slate of presidential electors. Is this a likely scenario for 2024, or is Jim mistaken?
Jim is not entirely mistaken, no. So there's what Jim is referring to, and this is going to be a bit above my pay grade, although some of my colleagues can speak to this quite eloquently. What Jim is referring to is something called the independent state legislature theory, this idea that state legislators, by virtue of what we would consider to be a misreading of the Constitution, are kind of unbound by state law, by state courts, and by state constitutions, and could take actions that most of us, I think, in this room would consider very undemocratic. I'm not going to be the expert to speak to the particulars, but if anyone else or Jim is interested, we actually at Protect Democracy have a number of resources on this issue, the reasons why this particular theory is really dangerous and wrong, and some of the work that's being done to counteract it.
Bob from Keene wants to know, how under your proposals does the lobbying extreme impact the outcome to combat extremism from big money groups?
So how would, if I'm understanding this correctly, so how would
How would your proposals impact the outcome I'm having trouble reading it myself.
Sure.
How do the lobbying extremes impact the outcome?
So I think, again, I'm going to take my own interpretation of this question, which I think is, our kind of the implication, which I think is right, that our politics is largely responsive to very narrow interests, lobbying interests that have a lot of money behind them. The idea behind a more proportional system, and obviously this is not going to be cleanly true, but this is like the theory, and I think it probably would play out more in this direction than not, is that it would make legislators, lawmakers, more responsive to the population, right? Like right now, and we didn't really talk about primaries, I might leave that to another question, but lawmakers are very narrowly responsive to very narrow constituencies, right? I think we talked about this a bit in the presentation, like many, and this is on both sides, right, to some degree, are not responsive to broad cross-sections of the electorate, are not broadly responsive to their constituents. Consider even just with a single-member district, that representative is supposed to represent the entire district, but that doesn't really happen, right? They represent whoever voted for them. Often, that's a minority. So I think, the intersection of big money, I think my quick answer would simply be, we would hope that given different incentives under a multi-member system, lawmakers would be rewarded for being more responsive to a much broader section of their constituency, and probably less beholden to much narrower factions that often have substantial amounts of money behind them.
2 questions here. Would the revised system help or hurt representation for rural voters?
For rural voters, it should be fair. And so what I mean by that is if you constitute, let's say you're a group of voters in a more rural part of the country, and you constitute 20% of the vote, you should expect to see representation for yourself in 20% of the seats. That's the idea. Not 40%, not 10%. And so I think that probably changes depending on where you're looking around the country and how different voters are distributed efficiently or not. But the premise here is that just by virtue of being urban versus rural, of being black versus white, of being highly educated versus not, like whatever kind of way that you cut the electorate, shouldn't really matter. And I think that kind of speaks to, what at least is an ideal in the US of one person, one vote. So again, the goal with a proportional system is to get much more close to a system in where seats and votes look very similar as opposed to having significant biases where seats are out of proportion to their votes.
And the second question, why was the Republican Party not split or weakened by the Libertarian Party in 2016?
Given, what was his name? Gary, was this the individual I'm assuming who ran for president on the Libertarian ticket? So I think this goes back to, I mentioned this briefly, although we didn't get into it, with single-member plurality systems, voters, in lots of different systems, but this is how it plays out here, voters are strategic. I mean, I think that very few folks in this room, I'm certainly one of them, even if they believed in the smaller party candidate, in let's say like the Libertarian candidate, it's very unlikely that they're going to vote for that person in droves, right? Because there's this perception, and it's the right perception, that that vote's wasted. There's not room in our system functionally for more than two parties. And as long as that's the case, we probably shouldn't expect a third party like a Libertarian Party to make meaningful enough inroads that it would break apart one of the two major parties. And I think that that's one of the underlying assumptions that we have about the viability of third parties that's not quite right? It's the fact that, I don't know, they don't appeal to enough people, they're not well-financed, they don't have enough organizing power behind them. All of that might be true, but ultimately, as long as our current rules remain in place that functionally prohibit a viable third party nationally from emerging, the idea that the Libertarian Party would kind of break apart the GOP, I think, kind of remains, a bit of a pipe dream.
Do you think rank order voting would work or at least help some of the problems you discussed today?
Yeah, okay, I'm glad that this came up. So, ranked choice voting, called preferential voting in a number of other countries, is obviously kind of gaining some traction across the US, not just at the state level, but at the municipal level, among school boards. There's primaries, like the Virginia governorship primary this past election switched to ranked choice. And I think it's kind of really important before kind of making a judgment call on ranked choice to be very clear about where it fits in that design decision table, because it's only changing one type of rule. So what we were talking about with proportional representation, kind of the switch to multi-member districts, that's a district magnitude change. So kind of all of the benefits that I was speaking to derive from a change in district magnitude, and we don't want to kind of get into the details, but a change to electoral formula as well to make sure that seats are distributed proportionally. But it doesn't touch ballot structure. And ranked choice voting ultimately is a change to ballot structure, right? The ability to use an ordinal ballot, rank candidates, as well as to electoral formula, ensuring a majority and not a plurality. So they're touching different electoral levers, and they're probably also solving very different problems. There's a really good faith debate among scholars as to the benefits as well as the drawbacks of ranked choice voting. I don't think I have the space now to go into all of them, but I think one of the things that I would just offer for folks who are interested and are going to look into it further is there's a significant difference between using ranked choice with what is inevitably a single winner race, the presidency, presidential primaries, governorships. Like those will never be multi-member by definition, right? And then using ranked choice with legislative elections. So with single winner elections, by virtue of being, a single seat, ranked choice is probably a good idea. Amartya Sen and Eric Maskin, two Nobel laureates from Harvard, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a number of years ago, just after, I think, the 2016 election, and they modeled out how Trump probably wouldn't have won under ranked choice rules in the presidential primary because he didn't have broad-based support, right? He didn't have majority support. It's more likely that someone like a Marco Rubio or even actually a Ted Cruz would have secured the nomination had that rule been in place to secure majority support. So I can see situations in which ranked choice would be quite powerful. I don't think that means that across the board it's necessarily a given that it's a good idea, and I think for the sake of time, I'll leave it there.
Well, we have a skeptic here.
Great.
How do multi-member proportional systems get corrupted?
Oh, that's great. Okay, let's go. It was very common in the US for a very long time, all the way up through the early 80s, that states used multi-member districts. In fact, I'm pretty sure New Hampshire, for its state house, still uses multi-member districts. There's one really big and problematic ways that multi-member districts do the opposite of what we just talked about, have the opposite effect. And that has to do with the electoral formula that's used. So in the vast majority of cases, if not all, when multi-member districts were used in the US, they were used purposely to dilute black votes, principally in the South, and secure majority white wins. And the way that they did that was by using plurality rules instead of proportional rules to allocate winners. So you as a voter would go into the voting box, you would have, say, 8 people running for 5 seats, and you could have 5 votes against those 5 seats. Now think about what happens then. Every single time, a single party, as long as they have the majority, which is to say a white majority, are going to sweep. And so all you're effectively doing is adding seats to your already dominant coalition. That's obviously not proportional, right? It doesn't give the 30%, say, of black voters a seat at the table. So in the event that, let's say, the US Congress or a state house contemplates a move to multi-member districts, it is essential to avoid that scenario, which is how it would be corrupted. It is essential that winners are allocated proportionally to the votes that they receive.
Several questions. Thank you. You recommend proportional representation, which will likely result in more political parties. Won't more parties produce more ideological conflict, as we have recently seen in Israel?
Great question again. So I think part of this is responsive to the past question. There are systems in which the district magnitude is so ridiculously high that you have far too many parties and you create party fractionalization. I wouldn't necessarily call that ideological conflict as much as just ungovernability, right? It just becomes like chaos. And so for a lot of reasons, I think that that's probably a quite bad idea. But you can imagine a world, and you don't have to imagine it, we have lots of other countries to compare ourselves to, in which having 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of significant national parties would do the opposite in terms of ideological conflict. It would allow parties in Congress to bargain, to create deals, to form fluid coalitions on different topics, as opposed to the current situation, which is zero-sum. Every time the Democratic Party wins, the Republican Party loses. Every time the Republican Party wins, the Democratic Party loses, right? As someone who works occasionally with folks on the Hill, is every day, right? Like we cannot give an inch. And so I think one major and significant proposition behind proportional representation is how Congress would behave differently. You would open up a lot of space for more fluidity, for more deal making, for adding value as opposed to seeing everything as zero-sum. And so in that way, I think that a lot of the scholars who have written extensively about proportional representation are quick to point out that like really matters in the legislature, being able to make deals with people across the table, and our binary structure right now is not facilitating that.
Several questions. How can Congress institute multi-member districts, or even legislatures, when it would work to the disadvantage of the overrepresented party? Why would Republican members of Congress support this change, and how can it?
And this is the golden question. And it's something that a number of us were talking about outside as well, which is, great, this is all well and good, but back to the question of being an optimist or a pessimist, like, how in the hell does something like this actually happen? Big transformational change through the US Congress right now seems like a pipe dream. I'm not going to contest that. That said, two things. One, I don't think we have any choice but to be an optimist. But two, in speaking a bit more realistically, I think that there are plausible pathways that we can contemplate where proposals like proportional representation are potentially quite appealing. So I'll give you at least one, maybe two. Often coupled with proposals for proportional representation are proposals to expand the House. So as folks may know, up until the early 1900s, the US House expanded every decade to keep pace with America's growing population, right? I think the founders initially thought that we would probably have a ratio of 1 to 30,000 representatives to constituents. It's now 1 to over 700,000. The US actually has one of the smallest national legislatures, second only to India, of all of the world's democracies as a fraction, relative to its population. I'm going to tie this to the political issue in a second. There's a number of merits as to a bigger House, right? Like, it's just not functionally plausible that one representative is going to effectively represent 700,000 people. Smaller houses have been associated with more extremism, catering towards wealthier constituents. There's kind of a whole number of reasons why the US House is probably far too small. Proposals to expand the House, those merits aside, might make something like proportional representation a little bit more palatable to sitting lawmakers. And the reason is they're less likely to get voted out. Right? If you have more seats, you're contesting less seats, it's more likely as an incumbent that you're not going to go anywhere at least, the next few rounds. So simply by opening up the number of seats available, as opposed to kind of forcing them to kind of run through the eye of the needle, those two packages together might be a little bit more politically palatable. I think the other thing that I'll mention just on this point is, I don't think it's obvious often who would stand to benefit. And I think that's like a good thing. I think it's like really interesting. So think about like Massachusetts. There are like a lot of Republicans in Massachusetts. You would not know that from their congressional delegation, right? So there are different political constituencies that stand to benefit from fair representation, and to whom proposals like PR might be quite interesting.
This person is looking for a history lesson, and we will all benefit. Could you give a quick summary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
I can't. I mean, I could try, but I'm not the right person. I'm not the historian, and I'm not a specialist in civil rights. And so if there's one question that I feel like I really, really should leave to the expert, it's probably that one.
All right, then I'll skip the second part of that question out of kindness to you. Why is the word populist used with authoritarianism? It seems like an oxymoron to me.
Interesting.
Why are these terms used together to describe a movement? Is the point to confuse the electorate?
That's a really, really good question. Two things. One, I'll confess, and I think I'm both like a victim and also like a perpetrator here. Using, I think, academic jargon is dangerous, right? You are used to kind of speaking among a smaller community of folks who share common understandings about common concepts. Translating them is both like not always easy and sometimes actually not that helpful, right? So I probably wouldn't advise that we all start speaking about authoritarian populism to the broader electorate. That said, though, there is a really good reason why those two terms go together, and that's because not all authoritarian movements are the same. The populist version of authoritarian movements, at least according to scholars of authoritarianism, political scientists, qualify authoritarianism with the term populism because what it's implying is, as opposed to, say, like an autocrat coming to power through sheer force, right? Maybe they have a military at their back, they're dispensing with elections altogether. Like, we would call that authoritarian politics. But that's not what authoritarian populism is. Authoritarian populism uses the rules of the game quite effectively. So often authoritarian populists and their parties get elected through free and fair elections, and then once in power, start to dispense with democratic commitments. Once in power, start to say, I don't really like the rule of law, right? It's not quite convenient. Or civil liberties and civil rights, not my priority. Or free and fair elections the next time around, maybe not so much. And so kind of holding those two concepts together, I definitely appreciate, seems counterintuitive, but it's important because what it means is, and this has happened in Hungary, this has happened in Turkey, it's potentially happening here, folks can come to power legitimately, and that's important, right? Like, we're protecting the rules of the game, but it also matters what they do once they're in power. And preventing those individuals from then dispensing with democratic commitments is really important. And the only other thing I'll say about that, and this is just like another dimension to the definition, is typically, and this is kind of where the term populist comes from, those types of authoritarian leaders are creating a very important division in the population that sets us up for very unproductive and dangerous conflict, where they speak to one in-group, right? Let's say like ethnically homogenous, people who have always been here, obviously it's never true, in contrast to outgroups, immigrants, minorities, and it's like a really important part of kind of the authoritarian populist movements we see in various democracies that are backsliding today, is that particular dimension of authoritarianism.
A couple of questions worded slightly differently. Why did you avoid mention of the Electoral College? And then, the second question on the same topic, why do we use the electoral system rather than one person, one vote as the Constitution?
I think the latter is referring also to the Electoral College. I mean, the answer is quite easy because it's really difficult and I can only do so much in those 45, 60 minutes. No, it's true. I mean, the Electoral College, well, you know, a couple different reasons. There's different, obviously, types of elections, right? Elections for the presidency, elections for Congress, for our state houses. I think it's helpful for the purpose of both remaining sane, but also like doing good analysis to kind of be clear about which we're talking about. And so today, for the purpose of staying focused, I wanted to choose one of those. That's not quite, you know, obviously the entirety of the answer. The other part is that proportional representation, as we talked about at the very end, is accomplishable through statute. Congress can write a law tomorrow that allows states to experiment with it, that could mandate it. Whereas the Electoral College, despite some kind of clever ideas like the National Popular Vote Compact, the Electoral College, just in terms of quite literally what's on paper, would require a constitutional amendment to change. So just very different avenues for accomplishing something. One certainly, or I should say potentially much more feasible than the other. There's a lot out there on the Electoral College, things that are potentially good about it, things that are quite bad about it, and ideas for how to change it. I'm not the specialist there, but that was my reasoning for disincluding it today.
We're getting to more general questions now. Would changing to a parliamentary government system help our country?
Another lecture again. I don't. So you know, one thing that's really hard in some of the comparative research on this stuff is often those two things go together: proportional systems, electoral systems, and parliamentary governments. They're not the same, right? One can have proportional electoral systems still with a presidential system, but often the two have gone hand in hand. So I think just kind of out of the gate, it's really difficult sometimes to do this analysis effectively because you have to like disentangle the effects of those two things. If I'm being honest, I think that the conversation is so academic and abstracted because there's, you know, it would require a new constitution. And I don't think that the US is moving away from presidentialism anytime soon. So I would just go back to the observation that in the context of the system that we have, constitutional system that we have, without changing that constitutional system, there is a lot that we can do within it that doesn't immediately handicap us because it would require constitutional change. And proportional representation, ranked choice voting, other reforms that are simple statute reforms, I think are really good examples of making change within the given constitutional order that we have.
John in Vermont asks, you suggested in the talk that you had some views on the presidential primary system. Would you elaborate?
Yeah, sure. We actually covered this a little bit, but having majority requirements, just to repeat this, in presidential primaries would be a very, very good idea. Having 12 candidates running that all split the vote and allow that one cohesive faction with like a third support to barrel its way through and end up representing the entire country with a plurality of just a plurality is probably not a good idea, right? I mean, ultimately, we're electing presidents to the White House that have a minority of a minority's support. And that is nothing sensible about that. And so figuring out ways in the context of our primaries, which again are not going anywhere anytime soon, even if I wish they would, finding ways to kind of mitigate some of the worst tendencies to empower those factions at the expense of more distributed majorities seems really important. And so whether it's runoffs, whether it's ranked choice voting, integrating majority requirement rules into primaries on both sides, right, seems like a really good idea.
A question from Martin in West Lebanon. What's the origin of the parties?
Of parties general or our parties?
Excuse me, of the primaries.
Oh, the primaries.
Can't
I was
read.
like, oh, goodness, another lecture. They were a progressive era innovation. It's actually a lot of good lessons here. The very quick version is in the progressive era, right, which was a response to an extraordinary amount of corruption in state capitals in Washington, huge concentration of wealth and corporate power in politics, among other issues. The progressive era kind of was famous for putting forth a lot of proposals, all the way from ones that caught on, all the way from constitutional amendments, right, like the direct election of senators, to party primaries. And the idea with party primaries was, at that time, you had smoke-filled rooms with a handful of party bosses making decisions about which candidates to field, often doing the bidding of those with lots of money. And then the public was given these candidates to vote for with no say, right? So there was a problem to be solved. The answer, which were primaries that involved the public, seemed like a good idea at the time. I think we now know that there are a lot of deleterious effects to primaries. I don't know if it's helpful to go through them here, but as I think most people are just intuitively familiar with, what you end up getting is a very small fraction of the public voting for candidates that then go to a general election. And because of our single-member district system, and the fact that the vast majority of districts are safe districts, end up de facto becoming the winner, right? Starting with that very small fraction. I want to just kind of plug one thing here, which is like a myth about primaries that I think is important to puncture. We assume that folks who vote in primaries, a lot of us are probably among them, are more extreme. And the research suggests that that's just not true. Or at least it's not easy to conclude that folks who vote in primaries, they might be more politically engaged, obviously. They might be tuning in a lot more, but there's not a lot of great data to suggest that they're actually, in fact, more extreme partisans than the rest of us. So then why is it that party primaries are producing such extreme candidates? Because they are. The answer probably lies, a group called R Street did some really good research to this effect recently. The answer probably lies with the psychology of incumbents responding to primary challengers, which is to say, incumbents perceive, often rightly, that primary challengers are more extreme and think it is to their benefit then to run to the right or to the left of them. So it's not necessarily being driven by voters, it's being driven by primary challengers and the response, the psychological response from incumbents. Anyways, that might be a bit of an aside. I think it's interesting. Suffice it to say, primaries started with the progressive era. They've changed significantly since. Like most of the rules that we have in primaries are a function of rule changes in the 1970s, which is also to say a lot of this is quite new and also changeable.
A final question, again, a general one. In its desire to avoid taking controversial votes, is Congress ceding too much power to the executive branch or the courts?
Yes. It's a very easy question, yes.
Could you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. It's so important to have, we have 3 co-equal branches of government, not just 3 branches of government. And Congress, for a very, very long time, for decades, has been systematically abdicating its roles and responsibilities in our constitutional structure. It is not entirely to blame all by itself. The courts and the executive branch have taken full advantage of usurping that power for themselves. I can give kind of maybe one very good concrete example of that, but before I do, but Congress has been a willing player, right, for reasons like that, that lawmakers have not stood up for the interests of the institution. One of the reasons I think that that's the case has to do with our electoral system. It's more important, and we see this all the time. We've seen this with January 6th as a really good example. It's much more important for most lawmakers to stand by their party, not to stand by the institution. I mean, January 6th, if it was anything, was an assault on our first branch of government. One would assume that the employees of that branch of government would stand up for it, and a significant number have not. And instead, they've stood by their party. Figuring out ways to change that incentive to make us less married to one of 2 opposing teams at all costs, that's something that proportional representation at least offers one avenue to begin solving. I think I was going to give an example. If that's helpful, I can, but I think we all probably know that Congress is not standing up for itself in respect to the other 2 branches.
Thanks very much for coming to enlighten us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Next week, I don't think the mic, okay. I think I also should have done a promo for next week when the MB Carter will be here, and the subject of the discussion will be race.